We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com.
Critics attack. It feels like I've been talking to myself again. But it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true. And it feels alright when they come and say to you, you're the only thing that makes us all believe. And it feels alright where the worlds collide. Manipulation stands to make us break. What time you said coming over you. You wish it upon a star. You wish it on a star. You are, you are, you are. You fight back, it's an all-out attack. It feels like I've been taken on the world's machine. Because I want it more than anyone can dream. You look back and it's all in the past. You tell me how you live by all the things you do. Well, you can be yourself, but maybe I'm not you. And it feels alright when they come and say to you, you're the only thing that makes us all.
Good morning, welcome along to NUFC Matters. Sorry we're slightly late. It is a big welcome to Ben Jacobs. He's worth the wait, definitely worth the wait. People were judging what kind of jumper you would have on. What you got on today, Ben?
It's not even a jumper, you know. I'm inside. I cranked up the AC, so it's boiling in here. And I've got a Mystery Machine t-shirt on today with a little bit of Scooby-Doo on it.
Shaggy? There you go. There's the impersonation of Scooby-Doo.
That was very good.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben. Anyway,
good
here
again.
We are. Shaggy, Scooby. There we go. Anyway, moving on. We've got plenty to talk about. First of all, just want to pay our respects to the late, great George Eastham, who has passed away. Announcement just come out as we were coming on to air. Passed away at the age of 88. Had a good innings, as they say. Celebrated, of course, OBE for his role in England's 1966 World Cup victory. 500 matches he played. Over 500 matches for Newcastle United, Arsenal, Stoke City. A very talented footballer, but also a pioneer in advocating for players' rights. So somebody who certainly made his mark in more ways than one. 19 caps he won for the Three Lions, and of course was a member of the 1966 FIFA World Cup winning squad. Our condolences go to George's family and friends. Okay, where do we start? Well, we've got to start because Ben is a Leicester fan first, Newcastle second. I can't let you on this platform without talking about the result last weekend. You were quite confident going into that game. I wasn't exactly on the crest of a wave. I opted for a 2-2 draw. I thought Newcastle would drop a clanger again against a team that they should be beaten. But Newcastle did the job quite convincingly last weekend, Ben.
Yeah, very convincingly. I think Leicester only had one shot on target. So congratulations to Newcastle, because what we said in the build-up to that game was this is not only the kind of game that Newcastle have to win, but it was an opportunity to really set themselves up, have a morale-boosting victory against a hit-and-miss Leicester side who haven't travelled too well on the road. And that's just built a little bit of momentum, hasn't it? Because after that, they went on and they qualified for the League Cup semi-finals, couple of home wins, and now an opportunity away at Ipswich to really build. And it reminds me of Tottenham, not that really Newcastle and Spurs are that like for like in terms of manager or style or anything along those lines. But Spurs went and they beat Man City. They lost to Ipswich. Newcastle now have put together a couple of good wins. Now you go away at Ipswich. Back it up. And suddenly you head in the festive period thinking that European football is possible. Don't. And it's constantly a step forwards, a step back. But this was an emphatic win against Leicester. I thought that Newcastle dominated from minute one. And as soon as one goal went in, I had no doubt that 3 or 4 might. Jacob Murphy was excellent in the game. And actually, even before the goals went in, he'd missed a couple of opportunities too. Isak always gets on the score sheet, however involved he is in the game. I like the fact that Bruno Guimaraes is getting box to box and can be a threat and have an impact in the centre of the park. And also when he gets into the opposition box and he's got the freedom to do that as well. And from Leicester's point of view, just nothing really. As soon as they went more than 1 goal down, they didn't muster a fight, an opportunity. I think we only had 3 or 4 attempts in the game. And like I say, just the one on target as well. So very much outplayed, very much outclassed. And in terms of the players behind that, I think there were several at Newcastle that were putting in 7 or 8 plus performances. Isak, for me, probably one of the contenders for man of the match along with Jacob Murphy, but I thought Lewis Hall was excellent. I thought Sandro Tonali, boss midfield. I've already mentioned Bruno Guimaraes as well. Defenders didn't have that much to do, of course, but there was barely a bad Newcastle performance out there. And if they can take that and build on it, as they've already done against Brentford, then the second half of the season is going to be very positive.
You've had a good opportunity, obviously, to watch Tonali close hand with that game. You see, bossed the midfield. I mean, again on midweek Wednesday against Brentford in the quarter final, he was superb. And I used these stats last night. I make no apology for using them again. Tonali played more passes than any other player on the pitch, 60. With an accuracy of 93%, ranked highest for successful tackles. He made 4, and he enjoyed a higher share of possession than any of his co-stars. His incredible fitness was also evident from minute 1 to minute 93. And following that up with this, I think from Squawk Live, Tonali's game by numbers against Brentford: 74 touches, 50 to 60 passes completed, 7 ball recoveries, 6 duels won, 5 shots, 4 touches in the opposition box, 2 goals, and 0.28 XG. I mean, stats like that, we've got a world-class player on our hands, Ben, and he's starting to get game time. And I think it's no surprise to see Newcastle's form improving with him playing more game time.
Yeah, and the money that Newcastle invested was not by accident or any kind of error inflating his either market valuation or potential. This was a player that Newcastle heavily invested in. And the reason for that is because, a bit like some others in midfield that have taken time, I'm thinking Enzo Fernandez or Moises Caicedo, he's got that high ceiling. And if you look at the League Cup that you mentioned against Brentford, he not only scored 2 goals in that game, but prior to that, in 2 other appearances, he'd got an assist too. So you got 3 contributions in 3 League Cup matches, plus all of the other stats that you just mentioned. And it sort of illustrates quite neatly that Tonali is as comfortable playing 6 as 8. And when you then think about Bruno Guimaraes, who can go deeper, box to box, or more advanced, Joe Linton, who can play midfield or in a front line, you got 3, let's just call them midfielders, even though Joe Linton, like I say, could be classified as a forward. You got 3 very versatile, 3 very confident, 3 very intelligent midfielders that can allow Newcastle that control of the rhythm of the game. And Eddie Howe's system relies upon that. When they were flying and pushing towards the Champions League, a lot was sort of made of Miguel Almiron's goals or Alexander Isak leading the line. But those players didn't get opportunities unless Newcastle were intercepting, winning more duels than they lost, playing positive, progressive and incisive passes. And I'm pretty sure if you look at the form from a couple of seasons ago, especially in the first half, building up to the Christmas period when everyone was clicking at Newcastle and flying, I think you'll find that a lot of the Almiron goals were him being fed by a midfielder and running from outside the area into the area and scoring. And that's probably because on a number of occasions, the midfielders were bossing the centre of the park, were winning the ball back, were pressing very well. And to do all of those qualities, you need fitness, you need intelligence, and you need vision. And Tonali seems to have all of that in his locker. So very positive signing. And I think the excitement for Eddie Howe will be the fact that it's 2 signings in one, if not 3 signings in one. Number one, it's a signing they signed ages ago that's only really coming to fruition now and is coming back from the ban. So he feels like a fresher addition than he is. And that can be a positive to the playing squad because they can suddenly feel stronger because of him, even though he's been around for a while. And then number 2, he's a signing that can play as a 6. And number 3, he's a signing that can play as an 8. So you kind of got 3 elements to Tonali and his impact. And if he keeps going between now and the end of the season, I think Newcastle are going to feel like they're very strong in midfield, at least especially when everybody's fit. And I think the last thing I would say is if you kind of think about a lot of these central midfielders, call them 6s, call them 8s, and I don't know why it is, they've all needed a little bit of time. And I can't think of many that have come from outside of the Premier League that on day one or season one have obviously slotted in. And Tonali's probably done it quicker than most because a lot of the reason why he hasn't been able to slot in is because, of course, he was serving that suspension. But I'm looking at like Ryan Gravenberch at Liverpool, who was maligned for a little bit. And then suddenly everyone's like, wow, what a player. He's so consistent. I'm thinking Enzo Fernandez at Chelsea as well. I even think in his first season at Arsenal, Martin Odegaard was not lauded how he is now. So for some reason, central midfielders seem to need that 6 to 18 months if they've come from outside of the Premier League to really settle and click. And Tonali, I think, is just like the perfect profile for Eddie Howe and his versatility. He's the perfect profile for what's around him. And he seems to, maybe because he built up some personal fitness and was waiting so long to come back, but he just seems hungry at the moment to really make an impact, maybe prove some critics wrong. And he's doing that fast and effectively. And even though we've only got a small sample from him, if he continues in this manner, like I say, then Newcastle are going to be very positive about their midfield and Tonali specifically heading into 2025.
Get your questions in for Ben. I see a few there. We'll wait until a few more build up because I've got a few topics I want to discuss with Ben. Good to see Gary V back in the chat as well. He's had his operation, so get well soon, mate. At least you're back home for Christmas. That is the most important thing. Talking Carabao Cup, Newcastle, of course, beating Brentford. I've already touched on that briefly, and Tonali's performance certainly was the standout one that night with a couple of goals. The semi-final draw, of course, took place the following night. Newcastle have got Arsenal. With that away leg first, how important that's going to be, Ben?
Yeah, I think Arsenal are there for the taking. I suppose if you just look at it on paper, you probably want Spurs because you feel like you can score against them. And Newcastle have got a great record against Tottenham, particularly at St James's Park. They just seem to have the number of Ange Postecoglou and the risk-reward type style that he plays. So Tottenham would have been ideal, but, you know, you got to win your semi. You've got 2 legs. You've got a home game. It's very even and balanced because of the format. And then who knows, they might get Spurs in the final. And then you're happy with that because you think you can go on and win the whole tournament. People kind of look at draws, and when you're in, say, FA Cup third round, of course, if you draw Arsenal there, statistically, you think, yikes, we've been unlucky because there's so many other teams that are lower ranked that you could have got. But when you're in a last 4, you expect a big game. And I don't think it matters who you play because you've got 2 legs in this format. So Newcastle will feel like absolutely they can go to Arsenal. For some reason, Arsenal are not looking as fluid or as clinical as either they've been in patches this season or under Mikel Arteta when they were leading the Premier League in seasons gone by, they have been. And I say for some reason because it's basically the same players, right? So when you look at the starting lineup now, Odegaard's back, Saka, Havertz has actually been relatively effective leading the line, Martinelli, etc. But I was looking at that League Cup game and Gabriel Jesus got a hat-trick as Arsenal went through. And it was his first goals, any goal, at the Emirates Stadium in 367 days. So the ability for Arsenal to kill games off and get breathing space in games has gone for now. And they showed that against Everton, where they laboured to a 0-0 draw. Of course, there has been one or two instances where the floodgates have opened, but usually it's against very poor opposition. I'm thinking about Arsenal's 5-2 win away at West Ham. But even in that game, they gave West Ham a couple of quick goals just before half-time, and then they scored again. So they're always giving you an opportunity. And when you look at Arsenal against serious opposition at home this season, in form opposition, they've struggled a little bit to actually score the goals they need. They let Palace have 2, and they were behind once in that game before beating them 3-2. They, as I say, failed to score against Everton. And I think there's been a few other matches away from home where they haven't at all looked convincing. They were very, very lucky, I think, to get something from the Fulham game, which I covered for TalkSport. It was 1-1. They were away from home. Fulham had their tactical number in that game. Arsenal didn't create many meaningful chances. They lost away at Inter in the Champions League. And let's not forget, Newcastle have already beaten them at St James's Park 1-0 in the Premier League when Isak scored that goal. And I didn't think that Arsenal were very good or much of a threat in that game either. So when you add everything up, you go to the Emirates Stadium first, and you're probably not going to lose significantly, even if Arsenal play well, because I just think they're not that kind of team at the moment. You take them back to St James's Park with a draw, even if you're losing 1-0, 2-1, whatever, you're quite confident of getting through that game over 2 legs. So I think Newcastle will be quite content with the draw. And to sort of address the point you made right at the beginning, the fact that they bring them back to St James's Park second, I think they'll see as a positive too.
Yeah, I would agree. Anybody at that level is going to be difficult. You know, you don't get to a semi-final being a poor team. I get where you're coming from with Spurs, but Spurs are so Spursy this season that ultimately they could go and beat Liverpool in the semi-final over 2 legs, and we could end up with a Newcastle Spurs final, which would be fantastic. But it's exciting. The 2-week break doesn't really concern me, to be perfectly honest. Is it a month break between the 2 games? But either way, it's a long time. That's the one big difference. But it'll be interesting to see how how it all pans out. January could be a really interesting month for Newcastle again, depending on how our Christmas goes as well. The Christmas fixtures, of course, separate the men from the boys, which we'll have a look at as well. It is the Sir Bobby Robson derby today. Of course, the late great Sir Bobby managed both teams, Ben, and this really is an interesting game for Newcastle in the sense that they go into it without Joe Linton, who is suspended. But Ipswich go in, Kieran McKenna's side go in without their top scorer, Liam Delap. He's serving a 1-match ban as well after getting his 5th caution of the season. He scored 6 of their 16 Premier League goals so far. Of course, they haven't won at home yet this season, which I know a lot of Newcastle fans are going, oh, no, not another one of these. You know, wherever it seems to be this case, Newcastle always seem to be the team turning up to hand the victory on a plate. But I think Delap being out gives Newcastle a huge advantage. Yeah,
I think it does give them a big advantage because he's been phenomenal to the point where a club like Chelsea or even Man City bringing him back are starting to look and say, is this the sort of player that could play at a top elite level? And Ipswich have weirdly been better away from home than at home. So I think Newcastle will fancy their chances in this game. Ipswich, I remember, won the last meeting in the Championship 3-1. I think that was in 2017. But generally, Newcastle have had a good record against Ipswich. I think that victory in 2017, I was at the game covering that as a reporter. That was back in the Championship. I seem to recall that win was kind of Ipswich's first over Newcastle in sort of 15, 20 odd years. So they'll be quite confident. It's a nice trip going down to Portman Road. I think a lot of young Newcastle fans maybe will never have been there, and because of their age, may not have that much affinity or even knowledge of Sir Bobby Robson. So it's a good opportunity. I always think these kind of fixtures for younger fans to look up the connection, look up the love for Bobby. I'm sure that a lot of Newcastle fans will, as they always do, travel well, attend. And I think the fans will acknowledge Bobby. And that's nice because, when you're middle-aged like I am, seeing Bobby like we do there, it's just second nature. You know him, you remember him, the warm accent, the personality, the love that people had for him in the game. And then you think of maybe a 18-year-old who may not really understand the connection, statue or no statue, internet or no internet. So these fixtures are always a good opportunity to remember Bobby for both clubs. But from Eddie Howe's point of view, there's obviously no room for sentiment or anything like that. This is a game that Newcastle United simply have to win. And it's a big opportunity because Liverpool are playing Spurs. So one of those teams is going to drop some points. And that middle part of the table is very tight. And if you get lucky with other results, you jump from 23 to, I think, 26. And you might find yourself just 1 point behind Man City in a table where fifth place might be good enough for Champions League. And with 17 games gone and 26 points, you say, brilliant, we're firmly in the race for some kind of Champions League push, presuming that fifth place and that coefficient gets Champions League football. And you fancy yourself to probably catch Forest. You fancy yourself to finish maybe above Bournemouth. You fancy yourself that Fulham and Brighton and Spurs are going to drop points. You lose the game and you're suddenly potentially below Man U. And some of those teams might move on to 28. City might move on to 31 or 30, I should say. And there's a gap. So at that point now, you know, in the first 10 games of the season, win, lose or draw, the gap is not going to be so big. You think I'm running out of games, but you get to that sort of 18, 19 point. And there's a massive difference between being within a win of top 4 or top 5 or being 6, 7, 8 points adrift and finding yourself in the lower echelons of the table. So they have to go and beat these teams that they're expected to. Newcastle, Ipswich first, and then that horrible but also very useful run of fixtures in many ways. Home to Villa, away at Man U and away at Tottenham over the festive period. And of course, on paper, that's very difficult. But imagine the difference between beating Leicester, beating Brentford, beating Ipswich, and then playing a Villa side that don't travel well, a Manchester United side that are there for the taking at the moment, and a Spurs side that who knows what team are going to turn up. You think, brilliant. Imagine if you lose to Ipswich, then the fans are going to be like, yikes, we've got 3 horrible fixtures and we could be cut adrift by the time the beginning of the new year starts. So Ipswich away is a momentum builder. And I honestly think if they beat Ipswich, they'll beat Villa at home and then they could be in for a very productive festive period.
Okay, let's get a question. Ben, do you think all of Eddie's denials about January transfers are accurate, or is it the usual smokescreen and out of our rumoured outs, Longstaff, Trippier, Wilson, Miggy, Dubravka? Which do you think are likely? Yeah,
I think that outgoings are important for Newcastle. I still think that they have that PSR financial consideration for the next financial year. And that will obviously again be 30th of June, 2025. So there's like a little bit of time in some ways because you don't have to do it all in January, but they won't want a mad scramble. And when you think about the business that they can do, they also have to think too about what they may have to spend going into the following season, which can be based upon, do they have European football? Do they have Champions League football? So January is quite difficult because you don't want to overspend and then find that you don't get any European football again. And also the caliber of players they're being linked with will probably want to know if they do or don't have any kind of European football. So I'm expecting a quiet January. I think Eddie Howe is relatively true to his word. He downplayed a lot of the business over the summer, and he was right to do so. He pointed out that Newcastle were tight PSR, and they were. And, you know, if you think about the amount of conversations we had around that PSR deadline where people were saying, but we can spend X, it can't be that bad, PIF are rich. And now in hindsight, we know that they had to sell Minter, Anderson, line up the possibility of Gordon, and they won't want to be in that position again because they know that unlike last summer, where they didn't quite need 100 million. They didn't quite need an Isak to go, a Gordon to go. If they get to the point where they can't get some wages or some fees in, it might be that they have to sacrifice a big name, and even more so if they don't have European football, because they have to look at it from the footballer's point of view. Because we all know that Isak Gordon, Guimaraes could go and play Champions League football for a number of top clubs. So it's step by step for Newcastle. It's outgoings first. It's being financially prudent because they don't know yet if they're going to have European football next season, and they don't have European football at the moment. And it's trying as best as they can not to lose the massive stars. And if they're not going to lose the massive stars, if they're going to say, no, Isak's well contracted, no chance, even though Arsenal are interested. If they're going to say, no, Guimaraes, you can't go unless someone's going to give us 100+ million, even though Manchester City are going to be interested this summer. And if they're going to say to Liverpool, doesn't matter if you come calling again, he's not going, then you probably, instead of losing one, need to lose 3, 4, 5 smaller, and by smaller I only mean financially, smaller financial outlays in order to get what you need to be calm. So that's where that long list that you just put up comes in. Not all of them obviously will command big fees, but some of them will help you clear your wage off the books as well, which is highly significant too. So I think if we look at January and outgoing specifically, I do think they might be quite busy with one or two. You have Miguel Almiron, who, as I reported yesterday, is still in talks with Charlotte FC. And Charlotte were put off by Newcastle's valuation when they spoke over the summer. It was in the region of £17 million. Now that price has, give or take, halved to around £8.5 million, plus the wages off the books. Newcastle would do a deal around that valuation, and Charlotte are still keen. I'm not seeing so much Al Shabab come back for Miguel Almiron because I don't think the player's changed his mind about Saudi Arabia. So MLS is more likely for Almiron, but I do think they want to find a solution. And of course, if they find a solution for a right-sided winger or forward, then they might want to dip into the market in order to bring in another one too. With Dubravka, I think there's a realistic possibility he goes in January. We've seen some reports in Saudi Arabia that Al Shabab have already agreed a deal in principle for Dubravka. That's not my understanding at this stage. Speaking to sources at the club, what is true is there is an interest from Al Shabab in Dubravka, but there's by no means an agreement with the player or yet an agreement with Newcastle. Let's see if that changes. Of course, things can move very quickly in the January window, but at the time we're live, it's definitely not at the point where this deal is 100% agreed in principle. That's a little bit too strong, but the interest is there for sure. And then we have to wait and see whether Newcastle see any other opportunities in the market. A lot of the players that you put up there on the list, they might want to get rid of, but they don't have a willing buyer at this point. So it's not as easy as you think just to facilitate 4, 5, 6 outgoings. And of course, from Hal's point of view, if he feels that there won't be a significant number of incomings coming in, then he may prefer some of these names to leave at the end of the season just to make sure that he's not a bit thin. Because if you define Almiron like 2 seasons ago as your starting right winger, then if he's not quite up to where you want him to be in terms of output, most of the fans would wish him well. Fantastic character, always plays with a smile, but you'd say, okay, we think we can upgrade. But if you're at the point where Almiron's become a squad player, then there might be some fans listening that say, okay, let's just not lose one for the sake of losing one because he's not starting as many games. Let's just keep him until the summer, and then let's get rid of him in the summer when we basically will know what we've got, know if we've got European football, and realise we've got longer to find that quality replacement. If you only lost Almiron and didn't replace Almiron, there is a danger you pick up an injury and then it comes back to bite you because Newcastle could look a little bit thin in the second half of the season. So Almiron and Dubravka, I think there is a concrete possibility they go in January, but Newcastle have got a bit of a balancing act because if they don't have the capital or the desire in January to bring in a couple of additions, then they ultimately resolve the financial problem, but they do leave themselves a little bit thin in terms of depth for the second half of the season.
Simon Davies says, are Bakayoko and Trafford our main targets for January?
No, not to my knowledge. Bakayoko to me is being shot down, and quite emphatically, in terms of either how advanced it is or even talks developing at this stage. I think we're talking relatively loosely at this stage about targets that Newcastle have advanced on. So I can't confirm Bakayoko is advanced or as developed as others have, although, of course, I respect that reporting, and I'm not saying it won't change in January, but right now it's being shot down to me as being in an advanced stage, or there being a high likelihood of it coming off in January. He is a player that Newcastle have tracked and looked at for a while, but those close to the player and my Newcastle sources are not confirming that this one is anywhere near at the kind of shape where we could be talking about it as being advanced or developed. Trafford, we know, has a bit more concrete history because Newcastle had negotiated and had pushed and had made an offer. And of course, at that point, Burnley wanted, I think, somewhere in the region of 18 to 20 million quid. And that was not a deal that Newcastle wanted to do. The player would love Newcastle to make another formal approach. That hasn't happened yet. I think the feeling is that Trafford might be available for 12 to 15 million all in. And Newcastle may be able to make that one work. So Trafford could be the one to watch if they get another goalkeeper. But it still feels a bit odd if they get another goalkeeper if they don't lose a couple of goalkeepers first. So I'm not so sure if they think that Trafford can wait, or if they don't get goalkeepers out the door, I'm not so sure that they'll be that intent on pushing for January either, because mid-season is always difficult and there's too many goalkeepers at the club. And if Trafford comes in mid-season, you would presume that he's the number 2 and that Nick Pope keeps his place at least until the end of the season. So unless I'm missing something from a fan perspective, the short-term goalkeeper need doesn't seem as urgent as the longer-term desire to find an eventual replacement for Nick Pope. And the most urgent thing for me seems to be to lose goalkeepers, not buy goalkeepers.
Yeah, and the Carabao Cup will play its part in all of this as well. Dubravka, of course, has now played in the Carabao Cup, as has Nick Pope. Vlachomidos hasn't. And what Newcastle won't want is, if they are fortunate enough to get through to a Carabao Cup final, is to leave themselves in a position where they only have one keeper who's played, and you know, it could be a bit of a situation that develops, because Trafford, I would imagine, is probably cup tied. I haven't checked that out, but I would imagine he's cup tied. So it's little things like that. I know that's not the way a full transfer is dealt with, but you've got to think about it. You've got to think about it. And we have got a multitude of keepers. It would be very strange if Newcastle went out and bought Trafford, I think, in this window. But we are being linked with them, and we've been linked with over 80 players now. Of course, Barry Hogan, who keeps that spreadsheet, is continuing to do so, and some of the names on that list, I'm not even going to mention them, because it's pie in the sky. Newcastle certainly haven't got that kind of money, which it leads us to this next point I wanted to bring up with you, Ben. Something which I'd heard rumours of, but we chose not to discuss it on the programme because it was rumours. David Ornstein in the New York Times has published an article this week about reports of multiple Newcastle players in the dark over unpaid agent fees due in September. No explanation why or when coming. Similar delay on image rights to leading players, but now sorted. Newcastle say financial processing issue, not cash or PSR related. And that was also in The Athletic. It's a strange situation, that, isn't it? I mean, I wonder whether that had something to do with Amanda Mirdad's departure, you know, balancing act with finances, payouts of large amounts of money to, you know, people who were shareholders ultimately at the time. Maybe it had something to do with that, but maybe it also explains why there has been a little bit of a, you know, maybe a bit of a slump around the club. Another reason why there was a bit of downheartedness maybe amongst the squad. Yeah,
there's sort of two separate points here that David Ornstein originally covered. One, as you say, is effectively late agents' commissions. And the second aspect is image rights payments to squad members. And the latter is a little bit more difficult, but in layman's terms, and it is a bit more complicated than this, but obviously I want people to understand it, so I'm going to simplify it a little bit. The difference between agents' commissions and image rights is, in the case of the latter, the squad member representatives will invoice for that payment. So it's not as automatic in terms of the deadline when it is due. And if, in theory, Isak invoices late, then that invoice will be paid late. So there's a bit more of an obligation on the squad players to get their image rights money, but there's also no smoke without fire. And you wouldn't presume that every single squad member owed image rights payments would have all invoiced late. So therefore, the club are obviously in a position where, from a housekeeping point of view, a financing point of view, whatever you want to call it, they are late on certain payments, some to agents and some relating to image rights. And some of that is perhaps down to where they are being paid from. And it may well be that because of Newcastle's relatively complicated ownership structure, PIF are moving money around. And I know from being out in Saudi Arabia, sometimes these things can take time. But what I'm not aware of is this being a longer term issue. So some of the same agents owed money now from September, say that the club paid them on time for any previous obligations if they had worked together before. And therefore, this is very much a new problem September onwards. And it is an unusually long period of time for which Newcastle affiliates, such as agents or brokers or third parties, have not been paid. So there's an element of worry there. But to be fair to the club, club sources are clear that this is not a financial issue, like the money isn't there. This is just a processing issue, which, as you say, may be down to Amanda Staveley, when she was there, having oversight of this or taking care of this. You've also obviously got Darren Eales, who unfortunately, as the statement showed, stood down due to illness. So a lot of the sort of day-to-day of Newcastle that were empowered by PIF to make sure that the club's bureaucratic side was in order have gone, and there's been change. And it may just be that PIF, who haven't been particularly hands-on in terms of that side of the business, now have to be. Or, as I said before, it can be that they're moving money around in order to make these kind of payments, which would make it more what we would call a processing issue. But Newcastle responded to David's story and effectively said that the relevant deposits into the relevant accounts, whether into a club account and then out to the agents or players, or whether they just mean deposited directly into the necessary accounts directly, Newcastle's position is that this money has been paid, it's on the way. And they also argue that not every agent has faced a delay and not every player has faced a delay in receiving applicable money due to them for image rights purposes. So when you sort of spell it out, you think, yikes, has it got something to do with profit and sustainability? Newcastle say no. You think, uh-oh, has the money run out? Newcastle say no. Plenty of players and some agents say that they have a great relationship with Newcastle and have been paid on time. But there are an unusual number of instances where people have invoiced and have not got their money. And as I say, Newcastle are putting that down to logistics or processing. And they're saying that it will be resolved in the coming days or weeks. And in many cases, the money is already on the way. So if we go with what the club say, it's a strange one. It's a mysterious one, but they ultimately argue it's rectified. And the good news is, if Newcastle's position is genuine, and we have no reason to believe it is not, that this is not tied into PSR, because obviously if they were withholding the money because they didn't have it, or they needed to put it into more urgent areas, or they were waiting for money to come in the January window, that would be a little bit more worrying. And the last thing I'd say is it's logical that it wouldn't be PSR related, because PSR is about books. So regardless of whether or not you do or don't pay the money physically, it's still on your book outlay. Like, you can't not pay an agent fee and then hide the agent fee unless you write to the agent and say, can we change the payment terms of when we owe you this? And can you formally defer it to a different financial year? But an agent would never do that. So whether or not they pay it, it doesn't actually have a reflection on the books, because you've still got to list the fact that that is an outlay. And if you choose not to pay that outlay, it will still be part of your financial considerations. You can't not pay it and then hide it from the books. So it would be logical, therefore, that this would have no bearing on PSR, because even if they never pay any of this money, and of course it's the opposite in this case, but even if they hypothetically said, yikes, we don't have the money, we're not paying the money, it would still be there on their books for PSR purposes. So we should distinguish between what Newcastle are calling a processing issue and PSR, because they are two very separate things in this story.
One thing that would help Newcastle's PSR woes is sponsorship income. And are you hearing anything on that? Ali's asking. Peter Silverstone's been very quiet over the last couple of months. Is there anything bubbling away? Have you heard, Ben?
Nothing really, to be honest, other than the fact that you work about a year ahead in an ideal world. So, of course, they are working towards the summer and have been for quite some time. And I would imagine that we are going to see more partnerships or sponsors coming in, but not necessarily between now and the end of the season. What you look to do is try and gain value from your project and your club. And like Chelsea have found as well, if you are in a period without European football or outside of the Champions League, then your asking price is seen as too high, or it's harder to attract long-term partners because they want to see first whether you're going to get back into European football. And European football, if you miss it for a season as a player, may not be as big a deal, because you say we back ourselves to get it back again. But as a sponsor, European football is X amount of television viewers, it's X amount of additional games, it's X amount of additional exposure on things like social media. So it does make all the difference in the world, because even if you just get Europa Conference League, you've got 6 group games, you've got knockout stage, you've got prize money, you've got buzz, you've got midweek games, and a sponsor is going to want to put value on that. And the thing that people don't always realize, it obviously differs from sponsor to sponsor, but a lot of sponsors that are a bit more front facing, so betting partners, even though we know that that won't be on the front of shirt in the long run, airlines, banks, cars, technology companies, they understand that if they are to get a return on investment in a tangible way, i.e. money back, then it becomes important that the football club help them tap into their global audience. So is a global Newcastle fan going to fly over and watch a game? And if they are, and you've got an airline sponsor, are they going to book using that airline? If you're torn between 2 cars and one of them is a Newcastle United affiliated car and the other isn't, are you going to buy that car? If you've got Flutter and you're in a territory where the betting partner the club operates, are you going to use that betting partner? And all of this can end up helping the sponsor basically get business back direct to consumers. Not in every case, because some sponsors are not eligible for Newcastle fans to use, or some are more B2B than they are consumer facing. But the sponsor's looking for the return on investment. And European football is important, not just because of the television numbers and the kudos. It's important because it's the only time when you're traveling to a different country, you're marketing to a different audience, you're watched by millions around the world. Like, the Premier League is global as well. But all of this allows that sponsor to have far more return on value. And on the flip side, Newcastle will be sitting there saying, we don't want to undersell, we don't want to be short-termist, we don't want to scramble for something that isn't quite right for us, the right brand or the right value, and then find that we're committed. And then we get to the summer and maybe they do have Champions League football and they regret the fact that they rushed a sponsorship deal. So it's a bit of a balancing act, and it does require patience. And I can understand why it's gone a bit quiet at the moment, because the club is in a little bit of financial limbo. It's in a little bit of football limbo, because we're just at that kind of stage of the season where 1 or 2 wins can change the whole complexion. 1 or 2 losses, and you start to think we're not going to be in the mix for Champions League football. So it might actually be more prudent to let the festive period pass and then start working towards summer 2025, 22 games in, because at that point the table is just a little bit more locked and you start to realize what is and isn't possible. And from a commercial point of view, what is and isn't possible is actually quite important.
Kev brings up a question which doesn't surprise you. We always end up talking about these kind of things when you're on. Do you think the so-called minor APT victory by City gives us a chance to get significantly more income from sponsors?
Not necessarily, because I don't think it's a huge victory for City. You can call it minor. City was stronger. They think it's major. Premier League claim victory as well. But the reality is that what has happened to date is that the Premier League's amendments to rules they believe are within EU law have been made. And unless City challenge that and throw the rule book out, the Premier League will argue, as they've done in public in their statement, that the basic framework has actually been endorsed, not challenged by the European Court. City obviously argued differently. And then after the two sides claimed victory, the Premier League made their amendments and they were voted on and they were passed. And City didn't want those amendments voted on. So we wait and see now whether they challenge again. But as of now, the major thing that's changed in the associated party transaction rules is that shareholder loans are factored into them, which is bad news potentially for Arsenal and Brighton. But City themselves and Newcastle are not as affected. And a shareholder loan has traditionally been interest-free. And now clubs that have shareholder loans will have to factor in interest to them going forwards. So that's one big change that doesn't hugely affect Newcastle. Plus the fact that if clubs are worried about shareholder loans, some may consider converting the debt to equity, which is basically a way around it anyway if they need to. So we're still not in a position where you can just go and do an associated party transaction and not have fair market valuation, which would have been the big window of opportunity for clubs like Newcastle and City to just go and find linked parties for sponsorship and have big injections of cash and not be worried about fair market valuation. But fair market valuation still exists. So nothing has really changed at this point for Manchester City or Newcastle, but we wait and see whether it's further challenged in a European court in order to more significantly redefine those rules, because City still feel that the rules are not perfect, which is why we can't call it that much of a victory for them. And I think Newcastle will be in the same boat. So I'm not expecting too much to change in the short term, but what I am expecting is City to be looking very closely at the new Premier League amendments to the associated party transaction rules in order to determine whether any further legal action is necessary.
Okay, David said, Ben, if we sell a couple of squad players in January for a total of 15 million, would that generate us enough headroom to buy a decent right winger in January with amortization?
Yeah, and I think amortization anyway gives you the opportunity. So what you're looking to spend is kind of your net spend first and foremost. And then if you're going to spend, you have to work out how much actual cold hard capital you need up front to make your sort of first installment. But beyond that, amortization does give you that leeway, as does the fact that within the amortization period, that up to 5 years, if you choose to amortize it over 5 years, will likely outlast PSR anyway. And if you know your amortization is going to outlive PSR, then you may also know that in year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5 of amortization, whatever the fee is, the financial rules will give you a little bit more flexibility if they change and become more aligned with UEFA's squad cost control measures. And in light of that, I don't think that Newcastle will be too worried about going out there and finding a right winger or a right forward. I think that they'll be more concerned with, can they find the right profile at the right price in January? Because January mid-season, it's hard to get the kind of box office names that they may like. It's tough in January because it's a fast window. It's really a seller's market. And by that, I mean the seller knows you have need and urgency and time is running out. And often the seller doesn't want to sell mid-season. So if you want to buy, you often have to pay above the odds. So trying to find a right winger at 15 million that could maybe be a starting right winger or a forward, could be quite tricky. But absolutely, if Newcastle bring in, let's just call it 15 million, then I think with amortization factored in, they would look to at least add one, likely a right winger in the January market. But imagine a scenario where they've got a right winger for 20, 30 million they think they can get in the summer. They're not necessarily going to take 10, 15 million in January, because then they know that it might sell them out of a target they want more in the summer. And that's where the real balancing act is, that's not only financial, but for James Bunce, Paul Mitchell to think about, do we want something now because we need something now, even if they're not perfect for us? Or do we play a waiting game to get a summer target and put all of our resources in that? And this is where Newcastle may not be able to have the luxury of finding a right winger at 10, 15 million in January and still finding a right winger at 30, 35 million in the summer. With the question on the screen from Gary about how does amortization catch up with you later? Think of it like a credit card. Take out your credit card number one. The lending facility is relatively small, and you think, brilliant, I'm going to pay back £10 every month off my credit card. There's credit card number one. Then you go, I'm eligible for a second credit card, a third credit card, a fourth credit card. Suddenly, every single month, each of those £10 on each credit card seems small, but you've now got 10 credit cards, which means that every month you're paying 100 quid and suddenly you can't afford it. So if you amortize, i.e. take the transfer fee and for book purposes, split it by 5, then when you first do it, that outlay may seem really small because maybe you're dealing with a 5 million fee. So it's 1 million every accounting year over 5 years. But it means that 1 million is staying with you for 5 years instead of falling off after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So if in that 5 years, Newcastle make another, let's just call it 20 signings over 5 years, over however many windows, if they need to amortize each of them because they need the minimum on each annual books because the numbers are tight, then not only will they have all of the new amortization, so at the time in 2028, we have the same conversation and you make a signing for another 5 million, everyone will say, but we can afford it, right? Because we're just dividing the 5 by 5. So it's only 1 million for the books. But then you go, oh, wait a minute, we've got all the 2027 times we did that, all the 2026 times we did that. So instead of your starting amortization being a low number, you've got 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 that you still owe the annual amortization on. So each year, the amortization that you're obligated for on that year is higher and higher and higher and higher. So it's almost like, in very simple terms, you're racking up a credit card debt.
Okay, that's simple in layman's terms. Thanks for explaining that. We've got about 5-6 minutes left. Thanks to everybody watching on Twitter. Over 1,800 of you watching live this morning, and that leaves us 1,600 on Twitter. So please head over to NUFC Matters on YouTube. Hit the subscribe button. We do 7 shows a week. Any news on selling Longstaff, asks Roger.
Yeah, nothing at the moment. I think Eddie Howe really likes Longstaff, and we've seen that really probably in the last 2 years where he's been relied upon. I think he's still played, hasn't he, in 10, 15 Premier League matches with significant minutes. Got about half an hour, didn't he, against Leicester?
One of Howe's favourites.
Yeah, and I still think he has a role to play. He's still only 27. He's very happy at Newcastle as well. He may not quite hit the same games that he did last season, especially with like Tonali back from the ban and a few other things to consider. I think he played nearly 50 games maybe last season. I don't think he'll quite hit that, but Longstaff is not itching to leave necessarily. And as you say, fan favourite, homegrown player, and all of that. I think I'm right in saying that they've taken the sort of automatic option to also extend his contract by a year as well. And like that doesn't mean the player's staying necessarily. But what it does mean is that they protect the value if he goes. So what I can sort of tell you about Longstaff is that there are clubs that would like him in January and that will test Newcastle's position to see whether he's available for any minutes elsewhere on a loan. I doubt Newcastle would commit to a loan obligation or anything like that. I think they still value Longstaff, maybe a loan with an option. Who knows? But it's not a given, basically, that he'll go in January. I think some suitors will make inquiries because they know that Newcastle need outgoings. They know Newcastle needs some money incoming. They know they need some wages off the books. But he's not a sort of front of line transfer listed player compared to Almiron, compared even to Callum Wilson, compared to Dubravka. But he's there as a possibility for January. But they're going to have to speak to Eddie Howe if they go down that line, because make no mistake, as with Dubravka, regardless of how many games he's starting or how many minutes he's getting, Howe really values Longstaff. He relies on him. He thinks he's an excellent player to start some games and come off the bench. And like I say, that's why he's played something like 100 games in all competitions for Eddie Howe in the last 2 seasons.
Ben, with your contacts, is there anyone that would be more strongly linked with than anyone else, says Barry? Is there anyone who maybe been mentioned that that you've heard but we haven't?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few that I've given you. Like in the last show, we spoke about Richarlison and how if that price drops to about 40 million, Newcastle may consider entering that race. There's still Saudi interest in Richarlison. The big difference is that the player has decided that he's open to the possibility of leaving Spurs, but he has to think long and hard about where, because of his 2026 World Cup dream. So staying in Europe is still front and centre of the player's mind. The challenge is Newcastle can't be doing a deal at 60, even a deal at 40 is a big push. But to be clear, I'm talking summer, not January. So if Newcastle get in a position with European football with outgoings, they may find 40 million for a player that right now it feels ridiculous to even be speaking about. So that's more for summer than it is necessarily for January, unless some kind of loan with option or obligation presents itself. We've spoken about Jonathan David as well, very much available on a free transfer. There'll be several Premier League and European clubs alert to that opportunity, and Newcastle and West Ham are a couple of them in the mix there to keep an eye on. I think they will be in the mix for a right winger for sure. Like I say, I've not really had much on Bakayoko. I know that's the big one that everybody is sort of speaking about at the moment. But it is still kind of downplayed to me in terms of either how advanced it is or how developed it is. I'll keep posted if that changes in January, but I'll be perfectly honest with you right now. Not something I've really reported on because I'm not in a position to say that it is advancing. I think the contact, if there has been contact, is loose at best. Anthony Elanga, we know, is still a player that Newcastle would love on the right-hand side if they could get a deal there. Forest's position has been very clear. They don't want to sell. And right now, Forest have got just as good a chance as Newcastle of getting European football. So I don't think he'll be itching to leave at this stage, but keep an eye on that one for the summer as well. And that's pretty much it at the moment for me. I'm not honestly, and it's not that I'm not calling or asking, I'm not honestly hearing that many developed names for Newcastle yet. And that's just me being perfectly honest with you. You know, if I think there's legs in it, I'll report it. But I'm really hearing a lot about outgoings, and I'm really not hearing that much yet that is developing on incomings. I'm sure that will change in the coming weeks and days, but I don't want to get you overexcited about a name if I don't think there is that much substance in it. And at this stage, I just am getting a lot that is out there downplayed by Newcastle sources, which is either caution from those involved because they know it might be a difficult January, or it is because a lot of their efforts and energy are on sorting outgoings first.
A question for Ben from Ian. He says, "What's the worst Christmas present you've ever had?"
Do you know what? It was a Millwall shirt, and it's a really bizarre story. There's a family member who I won't name and shame, and for those of you that are late 30s or older, like myself, you may remember a show on Sky called Dream Team.
Oh yes,
with Harchester United, a team that played in purple. There's been plenty of similar things since. There'll be like half this stream going, "Who? What? What's he on about?" Harchester United was a fake Premier League team that Sky, because it was Sky One and Sky had the Premier League rights, they basically used to be able to take Leicester and colour the kit purple. And it started about a youth team, and then it developed to the first team. So all these youth players that were just on a training ground became Premier League players, and then it followed it into the Premier League. And they would use actual Leicester games because Leicester's blue was the closest they could get to purple. And if you look really closely, you see they can't colour all the crowd. So if you look really closely during games, you see Walker's Crisps, and it's quite clearly Filbert Street where they play. That was the old Leicester ground. So every single plot I would know, although sometimes they might take like a Newcastle 7, Leicester 1 or whatever, and they'd only take the Leicester 1, and Harchester would beat Newcastle 1-0. Anyway, flash forwards, because there were loads of seasons about it. And I loved Harchester United because I was like, it's basically Leicester, and I owned a Harchester United purple shirt, and that was probably the best Christmas present that I got. But flash forwards, and it got a bit more advanced. And then they changed the location and the footage they were using to Millwall instead of Leicester. And this family member knew that I loved Dream Team and I loved the show. It was my favourite show as a kid. And someone had obviously told them that it was all based on Millwall, and they didn't know it had changed. And I don't know why. They didn't know I was a Leicester fan. It seems obvious. I'm from Leicester. So come Christmas, they thought that I would like the Millwall shirt because they knew that Harchester United was based upon Millwall, without knowing it was previously based about Leicester and without knowing that I was a Leicester fan. So I had this gift. And they were like, "You're going to love this. It's linked to your favourite show." And I was like, wow, it's the Harchester United away kit. Because the Harchester United away kit was really difficult to get. And it was white with a purple stripe. And they had a dragon logo. And it was amazing. And I reckon those Harchester United shirts, by the way, if anyone's got one, are probably worth quite a bit of money nowadays. So I'm thinking, brilliant. It's either a Harchester shirt or it's a signed photo from one of the actors. And I open it and it's a bloody Millwall shirt. And I just burst into tears. And we returned it secretly without the gift giver knowing. We knew it was from the Millwall store. That was the worst Christmas gift that I've ever got.
That's the kind of thing a granny would do, to be honest, by mistake. But anyway, quick one before we finish. Tyson Fury against Alexander Usyk. I'm going for Fury with a controversial win because they like to have a trilogy. If I'm going to judge it on what I've seen with the weigh-in and the psychological battle, I'm going to go Usyk again because nothing ever really gets to him. This isn't Rocky. This is real life. Fury's tried to play that cool game, staring him down, saying nothing. Nothing seems to shake Usyk. The one thing that you look at, you think weight wins this fight. You've got to listen to Lennox Lewis. I discussed this with Lennox Lewis when he was in Gateshead about 6 weeks ago. And he said, if Fury comes in heavier than he did in the previous fight, then he will beat Alexander Usyk. But, Usyk's just such a clever boxer and a very intelligent boxer. If I'm going to go on what I've seen, I'm going to say that Usyk would probably win this again on points. But I've just got a feeling that this has already been decided before we get in the ring. And I think the love of trilogy, I think Fury might get a split decision and a controversial split decision on the card.
Yeah, it's going to be difficult, isn't it? And it wouldn't surprise me if we get a split decision either, or if there's a little bit of controversy. We've sort of already had controversy in the build-up with beard gates and should he be allowed to have a beard? It's kind of similar to yours. And does that cushion the blow. I don't know if you've ever been punched, Steve, whilst having a beard. I would hope not, but does it hurt less? Or is the sort of blow cushioned anyway? Naturally, because they're obviously wearing gloves. I don't think the beard makes the blindest bit of difference, to be honest with you. But I had this conversation with someone about football, and if a player like Mark Cucurella has that kind of hair, does it not impede their ability to make like clean contact with the ball? And would they not be a better header of the ball, all footballers, if every footballer had a shaved head? Maybe, maybe not. But yeah, we've had the staring, we've had Beardgate. We have the backdrop that Fury was undefeated before losing to Usyk, and now we have a situation where Fury can reclaim WBO, the WBC, and the WBA world titles, and that, you know, sort of trumps in many ways that loss, the original one, to Usyk, because he's then showing that he's a unified world champion. He's showing that nobody can have the beating of him twice. And it's almost like legacy extending if he comes back from adversity. And that's kind of what I love about boxing, by the way, that if you look back 10 years, 15 years, I think Joe Calzaghe, who was undefeated, I even think of sort of the Mike Tyson era, boxers dodged fights to protect their record. And if you had someone that was like 30-0, it didn't mean that much to me watching, because so many of the fights were just like, they didn't want to take that fight. They didn't want to go up or down a class. They didn't want to try and unify. They didn't want to try and be an undisputed, in this case, heavyweight champion. So you go, okay, now they're meeting each other. And then the question is, are they meeting each other, and is it a bit staged? Are they purposefully having more than one fight? Are they purposefully having a win each and then a kind of decider? Because that's how you rake in the money. So I hope it doesn't turn into a spectacle and drama. I hope it doesn't turn into anything staged. And I think if you take away the pomp and you take away the backdrop and narrative, and you only look at this as to how is one fighter or the other fighter going to win, Fury's going to win if it becomes a fight of physicality, and Usyk is going to win if he can change the rhythm of the fight and make it a little bit more technical. And my money is that it will go the distance, and I do actually kind of fancy Usyk to, from an intelligence point of view, outbox Fury. So then it's just a case of, if we watch him intelligently outbox Fury, are we going to get a controversial split decision that still gives it to Fury in a fight that to the naked eye looks like it's an Usyk victory? And I would never pre-predict controversy like that. Let's think the best of all our judges. But if we wake up and to the naked eye, Usyk won the fight, but to the scorecards, Fury won the fight, that would not remotely surprise me.
Yeah, I agree. Have a happy Christmas, Ben. We'll try and get you on next week, mate, because there's plenty of football to be talked about next week. I'll be back tomorrow morning, 9:30, 3's a crowd with Rai and Ted. See you all then. Take care. Bye, Ben.
Merry Christmas, everyone. All the best.
A big thanks to all our sponsors, Skips and Bins. You can find them at their website, skipsandbins.com. Contact them by email, www.skipsandbins.com/contact. Say hello to low-cost waste disposal with pay-as-you-go and contract waste management. A big thanks to Mr. Vicky's Sauces, handmade in Cumbria. You can find them at their website, mrvickys.co.uk. Email info@mrvickys.co.uk or telephone 01768 210 102. Thanks to United Group Travel, our fanzine sponsors. There are no strangers on our tours, just friends you haven't met yet. 2024 tours, 2 crew driver and courier, local family company, 3-star plus quality hotels and no interchanges. All excursions included. Their website, unitedgrouptravel.com. Email beverly.ugtl@gmail.com. Telephone 01670 632 460 or mobile 0791 666 4174. 2024 Travel and Tourism Award winners. Thanks to Media Arts for all the help with the technical side of things. You can find them at their website, media-arts.co.uk. Our podcast is now available on Sport Social Podcast Network. You can also find us on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast providers. If you want to support the show, hit the thumb up under the video, and that likes the video. Click share to share to your other social media, and hit the subscribe button. We do 7 shows a week. Or hit the join button if you want to financially support us. It costs $1.99 a month. Some dates for your diary. The NUFC Matters Christmas party is in aid of Newcastle Dog and Cat Shelter. Tickets £10 from newcastlelegends.com. The event takes place Saturday, 28th of December, 7 till 11 at the Tyneside Irish Centre. The Longstands are making a reunion in aid of Newcastle Dog and Cat Shelter Saturday, January the 4th at the Clooney. Tickets are £15 from the Clooney venue or newcastlelegends.com. Peter Beardsley will be at the Tyneside Irish Centre on January the 10th. Tickets available from Woucher or from newcastlelegends.com. And an evening with the Entertainers, 24th of January. Box office number 0191 243 1171 or website Tyne Theatre and Opera House.uk. The Lee Clark event is now taking place at the Tyneside Irish Centre on the 31st of January. Tickets available from Woucher. And an afternoon with Sir Les Ferdinand takes place the 6th of April 2025, 12 till 4 at the O2 City Hall in Newcastle. Tickets for that from ticketmaster.co.uk. We have limited fanzine subscriptions available. Go to the website newcastlelegends.com to order yours today. And Will Scott's book is also available from the same website, as well as the Backpage Shop, Waterstones, and WH Smith's.